So it's my great pleasure to introduce John Waldman today. And I've a lot of things written down, but I kind of know them all. He's a professor at Queens College of Biology, and he's been there for quite a number of years. And his career has started working briefly on the project called Westway. And you have to be kind of a lot of gray hair to know about Westway, but it was an amazing project which luckily never got built. And John was involved in it. And then he worked for the Hudson River Foundation, right, almost right from its beginning. And he was there for 20 years as a senior scientist. And that's when I met him. I was working for them as well. And then he went to Queens College. So that's his academic career. His biological career is very rich. He's worked mainly on fish. And all of his publications, which are over 100, are all about various aspects of the biology of fishes, evolutionary, ecology, genetics, a whole variety of things. And his interests have always been in diadromous fish that move up and down rivers and with the sea. And he has a very rich array of publications, but as maybe equally and more interesting are his books. And there's a bunch of them. And there's one which is very appropriate for today. And it's a book called Running Silver. And it's a really wonderful book. I particularly love it because it starts in my neighborhood in the Bronx. He doesn't know that. And in fact, all he talked about were the Italian fish stores, and he missed all of the preceding Jewish fish stores, which as a kid, I remember I was over with my mother, and the guy behind the counter would take a big mallet and go, boom, and kill fish because they were swimming around. They were all alive in those days, nothing lying on ice. He's had a great interest in the effects of dams. And this book, Running Silver, which you can't make much money out of this but you can see it online. You can read the whole book online. Look for Running Silver on Amazon, and you can read the book from beginning to end. Now, I know that nobody can read in books anymore, especially online, but it's there, and it's a wonderful book, and it's very engaging. And I think once you start reading it, you'll have trouble stopping. It's really an extremely well-written book. He has a whole bunch of other books, but another one which I'd like to cite is a book called Heartbeats in the Muck, and it's about life in New York Harbor. It's a really engaging, lovely natural history book. But there are really many others as well. And particularly, his first book was a compendium of books about essays about stripers. And then there is an essay by T.C. Boyle, pretty much my favorite American novelist. So he has just an array of experiences working on fish. I think I've now said everything I wanted to say. Today he's going to talk about kind of Running Silver and the issue of dams. And I'm just going to let him talk. There it is, Restoring Atlantic Anadromous Fishes. Time to Seize the Day. That's his latest title. So John, thanks a lot.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Jeff, for that gracious introduction. Yeah, Running Silver, I just want to explain that term. That was a term that was used in the old days when a river was so full of fish that the water appeared to run silver with their flashing bodies. We don't see that anymore. So my goal today is to depress the hell out of you and then to bring you back again with a little bit of hope.
I think this
is set up. I'm not getting the next slide.
just
Left and right. Yes. Okay. So these are the diadromous fish of the Atlantic coast.
John, I think we ought to get the microphone
Yeah, I
nearer to
think you have to
your
put it up a little bit.
mouth. We get up a little bit.
Yes.
How's that?
I think it's on.
No, it's on.
So move that to the right.
Now it's so dark. Yeah, it's on. It's just a microphone. It's not. Yeah.
It is on, apparently. I'll do my best.
Bring
So
it up even closer to your mouth. Maybe that'll help.
okay. I hope that works. So these are the species we have along the East Coast. Almost all of them are found in the New York region. They are an interesting group of fish because there are over 20,000 species of fish in the world, and fewer than 1% are diadromous, moving between fresh and salt water as a basic part of the life cycle. So it's interesting if you look at the range of species here, they go from the phylogenetically primitive sea lamprey all the way up to the most evolutionary advanced species, striped bass. So this life history pattern has evolved a number of times, and when it's left alone, it can produce incredible numbers of fish in the populations. But those days are gone for now. The ones that are circled are the ones that I'm going to focus a little more on. We have the alewife and the blueback herring here, and the American shad here, and then the Atlantic salmon. And the question that often comes up is, why do these fish homes? Salmon are famous for coming back not only to their native river, but often to the same reach or sandbar they were born in. And it's not been proven, but the argument is that there's certainty of habitat suitability. If you come back to your own river, you have a place that is sort of already certified as being amenable to your population. And not every river is the same for each fish. Some rivers are very strong in one and not in another. So if you want lamprey, go to the Connecticut River. If you want shad, you would have gone to the Susquehanna and the Potomac. So there is a certainty issue that probably is a factor. There's also allows for fine tuning of the migratory circuit. You know, there may be some rivers where it makes sense to come back young and spawn several times. Others that are big, large rivers like in Norway, where salmon come back once very often, but they come back as huge individuals that power the way up these difficult rivers. And then you get other kinds of adjustments morphologically and genetically and so on. So the ocean is the same for all these different populations, but the rivers are where the actual evolutionary selection occurs. And we have lost, because we have shrunken these populations so much, a lot of interesting forms, or they used to call them races in the old days. This is intra-population variation. So in the case of the Hudson, commercial fishermen recognized individuals they called yellowbacks, bluebacks, greenbacks, goldens, pinks, pink-faced, locust, chunker, and chunkhead. We just know them as shad. These kinds of subtle variations are gone. You can't support these rare forms without having robust populations. Atlantic salmon, in the Canadian Maritimes, Native Americans were believed to be able to identify salmon just by holding it up in front of them as to which population it came from. Again, they were cueing to these interesting adjustments. Nowadays, we have relic stocks that have just the primary genotypes. In working on the book, I was very interested in accounts of their abundances, and I have a whole slew of excerpts, but here's three that I liked. Alewives came up to the fresh rivers to spawn in such multitudes, it was almost incredible. In such abundance as is incredible. And my all-time favorite, by William Byrd, in The Natural History of Virginia. In a word, it is unbelievable, indeed undescribable, as also incomprehensible. What quantity is found there? One must behold oneself. I would say he was quite impressed. I don't know how many fish were there, but it must have been an awesome quantity. Now, contrast those observations for river herring with what we have today. They've been likened to passenger pigeons of the sea, and we know what happened to passenger pigeons. If you look at the chart here, you see the decline in solid blue from 1950 in East Coast landings down to recent years, and it's an abysmal record, but it doesn't begin to capture all the losses that occurred before 1950. And because of our concerns about these fish, Massachusetts has a total closure since 2005, Rhode Island total since 2006, Connecticut near total since 2002, and in New York, it's reduced in the Hudson and closed elsewhere. So we have not done well by this species. And I love this postcard. I was in an antique shop in Cape Cod, and I found it, and I thought, wow, this is the story of anadromous fish in a microcosm. What you have here is the Herring River in North Harwich, And if you've been to Cape Cod, you know that every other river is named either the Mill River or the Herring River based on their competing uses. And this river has been manicured for the production river herring. Here's the lake where they would spawn in normally. This is a little collecting pool that they drop the seine net into and haul the fish back to shore. These are barrels ready to ship the herring once they're caught. And I researched this. The peak landings of this were 3,700 barrels in one season at 400 fish to the barrel from that tiny little stream. And the thing about this is that it's totally predictable, and the fate of these fish is totally in the hands of people. If you went looking for those same individuals in the ocean in July or November, you wouldn't catch a single one. You could have a fleet of boats, you would never see one. But you know that based on history between, let's say, March 15th and April 1st, they'll come marching up in incredible numbers. And if you're smart and you let enough of them go from here to the spawning pond, you'll have a sustainable fishery forever. And if you're stupid and you don't allow enough fish to go up and you get greedy, it crashes. And that's the case for pretty much every migratory fish in rivers. So one of my great discoveries that I enjoyed was that Henry David Thoreau actually was very concerned about the fate of these fish. He's more famous for a certain book about a certain pond, but he wrote a book called The Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. He made the trip in 1839. He self-published it in 1849. It's a really good read. And he was paddling along with his brother. And from time to time, he would look at the early changes because of the Industrial Revolution and say, basically, these fish are doomed. We are ruining these rivers. It's all over for them. And in fact, the quote I love best from this book was, "Who hears the fishes when they cry?" He heard the fishes crying, even though most of society was thrilled over the fact that they were getting what they were getting from the river, which was not really fish, but rather power. You know, in those days, your power came from animals or water. And they were these massive mills that were based on hydropower in Manchester. They were 1.5 miles long of these mills. 17,000 workers worked there every day. And it was all based on water tumbling down the Merrimack River over the Amoskeag Falls, which was a place that in the Native American dialect meant that it was called the Great Fishing Place. Well, for not long did that occur. I visited the area and went to a facility that invited you to celebrate the magic of the Merrimack. And believe me, the magic is long gone. This was a fish ladder that was retrofitted to a dam, a hydro dam there. And theoretically, fish is supposed to pass through a viewing window that the public could see. And most years they see anywhere from 0 to about 100 or 200 fish for the whole season. In fact, the only reliable fish you're going to see is this fiberglass cast of a shad that's out there year after year after year. So in kind of wanting to take stock of this, I worked with a close colleague of mine, Karen Lindberg, who probably a few of you know, and we wrote a paper for Bioscience that looked at 3 metrics of change. One was changes in size composition, another was species and population persistence, and a third was changes in abundance. And size was difficult to find any good data on. We know we don't see giant salmon like this anymore. This is a image that you can see yourself. If you're ever driving up the east side of the Hudson, run into the post office at Hyde Park. It's just a 2-second trip off the main drag. And you'll see a series of murals about the history of the Hudson. And this one shows a roughly 12 or 14 footer being netted in front of a fishing camp in the background. And sturgeon in those days did reach that large. They weren't common, but it's known that there was sturgeon up to about 12 feet long, 800 pounds along the coast. We thought we didn't see them anymore, but I'll come back to that. This fascinates me. These are American shad from the Delaware River. These are big shad. I've never seen shad of this size before. I was interested in what's happening with shad because I think there's a phenomenon going on with shrinking fish. And I learned from John McPhee's wonderful book, The Founding Fish, about shad, that when shad were caught in around 1800, they packed 40 to the barrel. And in the year 1900, they packed 100 to the same size barrel. And yet they were all adult shad. I went and tried to research some of the data from shad fishing derbies along the coast. And I found that in the case of the Connecticut River, which has had a long-standing derby where people compete to catch the largest shad, that for the last 30 years or so, the winners were all about 5 pounds and even less than 5 pounds. Any one of those would win the Connecticut River Derby. So something is going on with them. We also looked at species and population persistence. And there are 22 species that we looked at that are found in Europe, North America, or both. And there's insufficient data about half of them because they don't have commercial value. So of course, there's no money to study them. But all the others have lost populations. Shad have lost half of their populations, 70 of 138, and about a third of North American Atlantic salmon populations were extirpated. But this is the, I think, the really kind of appalling analysis. We have here Northwest Atlantic, meaning the North American coast, and then Northeast, meaning the European coast. And we found data sets either on a species or a population. We standardized them to 1. And what you see here is a pattern over and over and over again of incredible crashes. This is Atlantic sturgeon. And this almost immediate decline is based on the caviar fishery that exploded around late 1800s. There was a period of about 10 years where the world went caviar crazy and caught all the sturgeon they could and brought these fish down to the point where instead of thousands of pounds per year, it was rare to even see a single fish in the river. Shad also have crashed tremendously, and I'll come back to that. Same thing for these other species on our coast, except for striped bass. Striped bass were a simple fix because the primary driver of their decline was overfishing. It's not complicated. Catch fewer of them and you'll have more spawners, and that's what happened. And they rebounded nicely. They're crashing again right now, and it's not overfishing. Something else going on. Same thing in Europe. I call this riding the asymptotes. The fish don't disappear. They just become really scarce as relative populations. So when you summarize all of this, for 31 time series of these North Atlantic fish, we had a 98% decline from historic highs in 13 and 90% in an additional 11. So it's a really almost shock. We expected bad news. We didn't expect to see that. That's how bad it was. So just look at a couple of case histories. Atlantic salmon. This is one morning's catch by these gentlemen wearing neckties in the Penobscot River in 1926. My friends at the Atlantic Salmon Federation tell me that they think that there were 300,000 to 500,000 salmon running into American rivers, not counting Canadian, originally. In 2014, the total dropped to fewer than 400. And there's a little bit of a rebound, not much, in 2022. And they're just not doing well. Shad have lost a great deal of their spawning habitat. This is a map showing the inland penetration of shad originally, and much of that has been truncated. In fact, about 40% has been lost because of dams. And just as an aside, I'm very interested in historical ecology and learning more about the early history of these fish and how they interacted with people. It's long been thought that shad run into the Hudson and ran into the Hudson as far as the Troy Dam near Albany. And in fact, every year, that's where you see them piling up, wanting to go past there, and they can't. But I found a reference that farmers in upstate New York used to go to Glens Falls in the 1800s and catch shad for fertilizer. And that's 50 miles more river that no one knew shad existed in. So we're doing an analysis of the benefits of dam removal on maybe getting fish into that new habitat. Really interesting case is the Susquehanna River. The Susquehanna is the major tributary to the Chesapeake. Shad ran 500 miles from the mouth of the river to Lake Otsego in central New York. And they were a huge part of the life of people in the valley. There were 4 hydro dams placed on the lower river, and fish ladders were built on them. But before that happened, there was a fishery in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where they would post a sentinel on a hill to look with a spyglass at the water, and he could actually see the water bulge when these schools started coming up. They would then launch the nets. There was another fishery at the mouth of the river at Havre de Grace, where it was the Stump Farm fishery, where they launched this incredibly long seine net one day, and then a fierce northwest wind blew up, and they couldn't get the net back, and it kept catching and catching and catching. And at the end of several days of dragging this thing in, they had an estimated 15,000 shad and river herring in one haul. Compare that with today. The thing about hydro dams is that they're required to count the fish that pass over their fish passage devices. So we know, we have good data on exactly how many fish have used these dams and these passage facilities. And in fact, just picking, well, first of all, the goal for getting these fish past the fourth dam to their historical spawning grounds is only 750,000. I think there were tens of millions of fish in the system in the old days, but so it's not a very ambitious goal. But because we can count the fish, we know that in that year, 2014, typical year, 10,000 made it over the first dam, 2,500 over the second, 1,300 over the third, and 8 over the fourth. 8 fish, and some years it's been 0. So try to restore a run that way, it's kind of hopeless. And I should say, in terms of the fish moving up these systems from dam to dam, they go up a fish elevator, which I'll talk more about in a moment, and they enter a reservoir with no current. So they don't know where, where to go next. It's sort of continuing upstream. And they waste a lot of time also being confused by these fish elevators and fish ladders. So by the time they get up to their original spawning grounds, those few, they're probably weeks late already in terms of being connected to the rhythms of the river. But they, as I said, they were a huge part of life of this valley. This is a big catch being landed. You just can't imagine that these days. Shad bakes were an important part of social life of the valley. Shad coming back in the spring were a great big symbol of the season ahead. And the natives of the valley would take the filleted shad, which is a very hard thing to do. There's over 700 bones in a shad, and roast them against planks and have these giant shad bakes. I went to one bona fide shad bake on the Hudson many years ago. The last one I went to used steelhead trout for their shad bake because they couldn't get any shad. So I think underlying a lot of this is the pervasive problem of the shifting baseline syndrome. I think all of you have probably been exposed to this. It's a very important paradigm in aquatic ecology. And it was something that Daniel Pauly wrote or named. Interesting that how it happened. This was published in, I think it was Frontiers of Ecology. I'm not sure right now. But the editor had one page left at the back of the journal and said to Daniel, I got a page, anything you want to say? And he wrote this landmark essay about the importance of looking back past quantitative data to early qualitative data and how important it was to capture the information there. And I checked yesterday to see how many times it's been cited. 3,400 times this article's been cited. If you have a paper that's been cited 200 times, you made an impact. So what he said was each generation of fishery scientists accepts as a baseline the stock size that occurred at the beginning of their careers and uses this to evaluate changes. When the next generation starts its career, the stocks have further declined, but it is the stocks at that time that serve as a new baseline. So he's essentially describing a societal ratchet. And here's an example of the importance of looking back in time. These are Potomac River shad landings, and they stretched from 1887 to a few years ago. And it's an awful curve here. We're not doing well whatsoever. We really crashed the stock. But look at 1887 now in relation to going further back in time. This is 1887. And looking at 1814, 1887, which looked pretty damn good in the previous slide, is almost pathetic compared to what was there earlier on. you got to know these things. It doesn't mean we'll ever get back here. In fact, I don't think we'll come anywhere near close, but it does serve as a reason for inspiration to just try harder. When you realize how far you are from the original reality, you ought to try harder. So in thinking about the overall picture here, I published a picture with Tom Quinn, and I published a paper with Tom Quinn at the University of Washington, where we looked at all the various drivers of decline. Drivers are things that, forces that interact with the fish populations. And we categorize them this way. We have those that are tractable and mostly applied. That includes overfishing, which is an easy thing to solve if you have the gumption to actually make it happen. It's not complicated. And then power plants also, they suck in a lot of young fish in the Hudson, and they are being, they'll be switching from open cycle to closed cycle cooling as time goes on. So there's not much we can do with that. We have drivers that are largely rectified, and that's pollution. The Clean Water Act of '72 was a major factor in restoring our waters and our animal populations. I'm not saying pollution should be considered totally solved, it's still an issue, but much less so. And I don't think it ever really, except in a couple of cases, affected these fish in a really profound way. And we have factors or drivers that are essentially untractable. One that I think does not receive enough credit, or if you want to call it credit, are non-native species. These systems, these fish were going up these rivers, theoretically placing their eggs in places where there are not a lot of predators, and then having their young drift down to estuaries. Now they're drifting down through a gauntlet of predators that did not exist when they first evolved. We have things along the East Coast that are voracious, like blue catfish in the Chesapeake, largemouth bass, smallmouth bass in the Hudson. They're not native, and yet they eat a lot of out-migrating young of the year shad and river herring. And the thing about them is once they're in a system, they're not coming out again. They're going to be there forever. And then we have climate, and theoretically, climate change is tractable, but who are we kidding? Are we changing this anytime soon? There's a lot of momentum there. It's not happening. So there's only one driver that is tractable but unrectified. And I'll give you a little test. Clue. What did the fish say when it swam into the wall? Damn. Oh, damn. So here we have a dam. This is the Conowingo Dam. That's the one that blocks fish for the next 500 miles of the Susquehanna. It's a hydro dam. And dams are truly pervasive on the Atlantic coast. This is the Hudson Valley. It's not clear how many dams we have. I've heard estimates of 1,200 to 1,600. Not all hydro dams, mostly not. Dams are used for many purposes, drinking water, recreation, or whatever. There's so many dams in the Hudson Valley that my former doctoral student, George Jackman, who worked for Riverkeeper for a while, found dams that no one knew about in the woods. We have a statewide inventory of dams, and he found some that weren't even on there. And this is Connecticut. All of these are individual dams. Rhode Island, they just pepper the landscape. And so many of them serve no purpose anymore. It's like having blood clots. It's like living with blood clots. So how do we get fish past dams? One of the ways is with fish ladders. Fish ladders are these devices where there's baffles and the fish can sort of leap from chamber to chamber and work their way up. They're very, very species selective. A striped bass will never be found in a fish ladder, or a sturgeon, but they work reasonably well for a couple other species. Then we have fish elevators for dams that are too tall for ladders, because the fish just can't handle that, scaling that height. They can be attracted to a flow here, brought to a metal basket, lifted up to reservoir level, and then released. And they sometimes work better than ladders, but they are highly unnatural. And I did an analysis with a student where we showed there are times where there's just too much water or too little water in the system for them to operate. So fish lose some of their access. And then we have the one that makes me want to cry. It's migration via the internal combustion engine. This is Operation Fish Run. I would paint that over. I'd be embarrassed. But what it is when situations where the fish can't reach the spawning grounds through these ladders and elevators, they'll actually net them and drive them past the dams and let them go. And this photo shows you the Kennebec River salmon run for 2024. Right in that trough, several fish. That's the entire run. Very, very, very sad. So one of the things you can do with these hydro dams and counting fish is look at their passage efficiencies. So we have first to second dam in blue, and first to last dam, which is where you want to get the fish past, in red. And you can see for these three major East Coast rivers, the Merrimack, Connecticut, and Susquehanna, the first to last dam is essentially flatlined. It's non-existent. And if you looked at number of shad passed as a percent of the target, and the targets are not ambitious. You see that Merrimack had this one anomalous peak, but it crashed right after that. The others just wiggle around between 0 and 5%. So what can be done? The best solution by far in almost every case is the removal of dams. And the great Atlantic coast precedent was the Edwards Dam on the Kennebec River. It was built in 1837 and taken down in 1999. It opened up 17 miles of river that were inaccessible before that to the next dam. And importantly, it allowed access to a tributary, the Sebastopol River, that is like a Shangri-La river herring. And that run in the Sebastopol went from 0 because they couldn't get there for 162 years to 6 million within several years. They just had to be given access. And that run has become locally really important. Lobster fishermen from the coast come and net vast numbers of river herring for bait. Lobster bait is hard to get. The public was so excited they created an alewife festival, and they have found it's become one of the most important locations for bald eagles in the spring to feed. It's over 60 documented in one little area feasting on these river herring. And generally, dam removals work extremely well. You see almost instant results. So let's compare a healthy river to a heavily dammed river. In a healthy river, you have fish coming to spawn over a broad period in the spring. Some of them will be going way upriver. Some of them will be going further, closer to the mouth. They may develop different subpopulations, different characteristics, and they can freely come back to the ocean and then come back again and spawn in second and third or fourth years. Not so here. These are engineering diagrams for two rivers in Maine. It looks like railroad tracks. And the best place for the salmon to spawn in the Kennebec, which is an incredible system, I had a chance to fly over it, is the Sandy River here. But just like with the Susquehanna, they face 4 dams in a row. And you can have a modicum of a run with just one dam. But if 4 in a row, it's essentially hopeless. There's no chance it's going to work. And in fact, it's not working. So they're trucking those fish, as I showed you earlier, past these dams. So my feeling is that in my title, we have to seize the day. There's a lot going on now that makes me think we can do a lot better. We should first ask the question, every dam should have an existential crisis. Does it serve a purpose? Is the societal value greater than the ecological harm? And there's no easy way to solve that, but many of these dams, there's no question about it. They're just there because they're hard to take out. They're not being used for anything anymore. The woods are full of these. This is a map of hydropower in the US. You see that it's concentrated with massive volumes of power in the Northwest because the Columbia River, TVA here, and here you see huge numbers of small dams. But these are the dams that were created first when colonists first came to this country. New England was settled first, and we have great concentration of dams in the New York to Maine region. So I think part of the argument here is this confluence of factors. We have an increased recognition of the ecological and economic importance of these fish. I think that we learn more and more about their values to the ecology of systems in terms of nutrients transport, for instance. Also, dams are sediment traps, and there are some dams that are absolutely filling up with sediment. The Conowingo Dam on the Susquehanna, that reservoir is almost full of dirt and not not water. And that's also starving the deltas downstream, which is an important factor. Then we have the dangers from aging dams. I had a postdoc working with me briefly. I gave him a tour of some New England dams. Some of these dams scared me. I'm not an engineer, but I recognize decrepitude when I see it, and they are not in good shape. They're just ancient by dam standards, and they're not meant to last forever. A dam is meant to be a temporary item, but we don't think of it that way. And then we have the maturation, and this is really important, of alternative energies. We have wind and solar, and they provide some opportunities that I'll talk about in a moment. So this question of the dangers of dams with our storms becoming rapidly more intense, we're going to see more and more of these older dams failing. In 2015, 49 dams failed in South Carolina when they had this crazy burst of rain, 10 inches in a very short time, and 15 people died. You know about the Kentucky flash flood a few days ago, where a number of people died when a dam broke. And these are the locations of dam failures around the entire country. So, you know, with each year, these dams are getting older. And we got to start thinking about long-term, how long are we going to keep some of these going? It gets very expensive to repair dams. Sometimes it's cheaper to just take one down. Wind has come on really strong. As of 2023, Europe has 5,900 turbines in the ocean for a total of 30 gigawatts. We have 7 turbines, 5 of them are off Block Island, you may have seen them, for 42 megawatts. Now, a gigawatt is 1,000 times a megawatt. So we have virtually nothing yet. We have plans for a number, quite a few actually. I think the election has changed that dramatically, and I think we're going to re-engage on this, but there's going to be a hiatus, unfortunately. The plans are for 30 gigawatts for the entire East Coast by 2030 of wind power. These are the locations where wind power is planned. So what they look like, they're much larger when you see them up close than you would imagine. We also have solar coming on stronger and stronger. I published a paper in Nature Sustainability where we looked at state by state how much solar power would be required to balance or equal the amount of hydropower they have, with the idea of removing the hydropower. And I don't have time to go through this, but you might look at this paper if you have any interest, because it's really detailed analysis. And what we found overall was that if you install solar power around the country in an area as large as Delaware, you could replace all 2,603 hydro dams in this country. Now, that would never happen because, for one thing, a lot of these hydro dams are on impassable falls in the first. That's why they chose these places. They have impassable falls, so it would make no sense. So some subset, some portion of Delaware in totality would be enough to replace a substantial part of the hydro dams in the country. So I did a very rough balance sheet for New England, and to get a sense of this. And the peak New England demand in 2024 reached 28 gigawatts. The sort of sustainable level New England needs by 2033 is 27. Then we have these additions that are largely to come: 27 gigawatts of solar power by 2033 and 3 gigawatts of wind power by 2033. So we're starting to accumulate the potential for an excess of energy. I know there'll be new draws on the energy with electric cars and so on, but this will give us the headroom to actually play games with removing hydro dams and consider them non-essential, and maybe swing the momentum more towards removals. One concept that I've been advancing hasn't been tried yet, but I like the idea. It's based on some work with Karl Lindbergh too, was the idea of a shared river where you share it more equally between energy production and fish production. So we published an op-ed in the Times about this, and in E360. And the idea here is you have a big lake reservoir, you have fish run up to the base of the dam, and they can't get past the dam. So if you were to reach the dam you would get back a lot of bottomland that had been flooded. Theoretically, you could put solar power arrays on that new land that's suddenly available. Also, you could have some power capture through hydrokinetic turbines that don't block the river, but actually manufacture electricity. And because many reservoirs are in valleys, you could have wind power around the edges. And the beauty of this concept too is that you already have transmission lines that carry the power away from the hydro dam, so you don't have to build that expensive component. It's there already. And in the end, you could have an energy park that produces more power than hydro dams did, and in a more resilient way because they're going to buffer each other. When one isn't working, another one might. Going back to the Kennebec again, those first 4 dams are here that prevent salmon from getting to the Sandy River. In total, they produce 41 megawatts, which is really nothing. It's just not a lot of power. We estimated that the area required to replace just those 4 dams with solar is about 103 hectares. Again, in a state the size of Maine, that's nothing. And Maine plans 3,000 megawatts for wind by 2040. So there's a move to put fish ladders on these and kind of lock it in for another 30, 40 years. We should be thinking long-term about the energy to come and the possibilities that are arising. So why do we have so many of these things out there? Why didn't we get rid of them a long time ago? You know, the little nuisance dams. One is property owners. Property owners like having their rowboat tied to a dock in the little pond behind the dam. They don't want to give that up. We have community pushback. People say, well, dam's been here 200 years. And the answer to that is, well, the fish have been here 10,000 years. We have uncertain ownership. Many of these dams are out there in the woods with no one has a clue as to who owned them. And even if they did, that person's long gone. And that doesn't matter at this point. Funding is very uneven. I don't think it's going to be generous in the next 3.5 years. We have legal fees. This involves a lot of permitting, a lot of lawyer involvement. You have contaminated sediments. If the sediments are contaminated past a certain threshold, you've got to ship them to Pennsylvania or someplace. And you have general inertia. It's just a lot of work. And most critically, I think, though, we need more implementation. We need more boots on the ground. There are some agencies that are doing what they can, and it varies state by state. Maine and Massachusetts are, I think, the strongest in terms of programs to take down dams. New York was embarrassingly slow. It wasn't until Riverkeeper pulled out some material in the Winenskill, which is up near Albany, and opened up the river, and river herring went racing up 2 or 3 days later, and DEC got a lot of good press about that DEC finally devoted some labor to this. But we need orders of magnitude more people working on this. You know, if there's 1,400 dams in the Hudson Valley, and my former student, George Jackman, who worked for Riverkeeper on this, was able to get 3 down over several years, we're just not getting anywhere. We gotta wrap it up. But there's some good news out there. There's, remember I mentioned the 14-foot, 12-foot sturgeon at Hyde Park in that mural. In 2018, side scan sonar showed in an image of the Hudson a sturgeon that was 14.1 feet long. So these massive beasts are still gliding past Manhattan in the spring and spawning up there very quietly. We just got lucky and got a facsimile of its presence, but it's just kind of heartening to know that these things still exist. And I don't know if this is going to work. Try. Yay. This happened a couple of years ago in a tributary to the Kennebec called the Cabasicanti. And that spring, there was a massive amount of rain. And the sturgeon, instead of spawning mainly or only in the main stem of the river, decided to spawn in this little stream, literally the size of the Beaverkill of the Catskills. And they came up from the Kennebec to this pool that maybe was 60 feet wide and below a bridge where the public could see. And I spoke to the regional biologist for Maine for that area. He said at his peak, there were 200 sturgeon visible up to 10 feet long. below this little bridge in this clear water. It became a attraction for the whole region to come and see this phenomenon. But it just showed you the power of restoring a river and allowing the fish to do their own thing. There it is.
Just click on the slide away from the video.
I'm sorry.
No, just on the slide itself.
Yeah, you better help me. Okay, so just want to finish up with a couple of thoughts about our own region. We don't have big rivers on Long Island. We have a lot of dams actually arrayed. You know, we have coastal plain here with water draining towards the ocean. And in many places along Route 27, we have the village pond. And many of these ponds don't have fish ladders. They're not coming out. We're not getting removals. They're too beloved for that. But we should have fish ladders on these small rivers that drain to the south. And there's one or two already, but we need to get a lot further on that. Locally, you have your own mill pond. I'm not sure exactly where that stands right now, but I know that it did wash out last year. And in thinking about what could be done, my own recommendation would be not to put up traditional dam if you want a pond, but rather use a nature-like fish ladder that looks like it's natural, but is actually man-made and allows fish to come up and into a pond and back out again freely. The only negative about that is you have to have enough of a room to have the slight incline to make that work. I think has to be 3% or less grade, but they work very well. There's one in the Deconic River that is passing large numbers of river herring. And if I was in charge of this restoration, that's what I would do. And the thing about river herring too is I said how badly these fish passage facilities perform, but river herring are naturally evolved to pass from little plunge pool to plunge pool in brooks and streams. So a fish ladder is not very different from what they experience in nature. And by the way, they don't leap. They have an interesting way of just turning on their sides and then beating their tails really hard and driving upstream, unlike salmon. So why did the fish cross the road? To spawn, of course. I love this photo. This is of a chum salmon in Washington. Here you see its compatriots lined up, thinking about making that crossing. And something in this fish's head is telling it that there's a spawning location further upstream, that it has to get there. And that's just a great symbol of the incredible imperative these fish have to accomplish this. Really impressive. And I'll just finish with this last slide. I was in Vienna a few months ago, and I discovered this environmental artist who I loved, Wasser, who had a whole museum devoted to his work. If you're ever there, I recommend going. But he had this wonderful insight. He said, the horizontal belongs to nature, vertical belongs to man. And I think that's bingo. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention. Do we have any time?
Yeah, we have time.
We have two student questions first, and then we get to everybody else. Molly and Zach. There.
Okay, so for the centrifugal count, and I actually really interested in, I saw the passage efficiency of American chat is like different from year to year, and I want to ask why it lead to that kind of like difference.
The passage efficiency might be reflecting the number of fish in the population on a given year. But also it reflects conditions. They change from year to year. Like I said, the fish elevators, when my student researched this across a number of East Coast systems, there were years when there was too much water and they had to turn it off, years there was too little water, they had to turn it off. The question is, when you have to turn off these ladders over the course of the season for X number of days, how much is that hurting the run of the fish? We don't know, but we documented that there is a general problem with this. And You know, everything from like needing to fix something that's broken to being a holiday and people taking off. There's a lot of reasons why these things don't operate all the time. So that's going to affect the number of fish passed.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, so clearly the dams are creating much more physical constraint on migration patterns than like offshore wind. And it's very early in offshore wind development, but I was wondering if there's been any like record of the kind of creation of offshore wind construction affecting migration patterns, like if there's been like a delay coming out from the ocean.
There are people working on those kinds of issues, but mostly about cetaceans. You know, whales seem to be sensitive to the vibrations. Fish don't seem to have a problem with these whatsoever. In fact, I would say they function as artificial reefs. I have some friends who go free diving along the turbines of Block Island, and they tell me they're just a column of fish from the surface to the bottom, utilizing it as a habitat and a location to prey from or whatever. So I'm not concerned about them affecting fish migrations. I just don't see the interaction where that would occur. But there is something going on with cetaceans, and I'm not the person to ask, but it's a concern.
There's more that goes on with birds and the offshore wind fields than with fish or cetaceans, I would say. In Europe, gannets completely avoid those places. If you look at the map of one of the planned wind fields just a little southwest of Martha's Vineyard, it's a major gannet feeding area, and if they load it with wind, they'll lose that habitat. So these wind plans pose very significant habitat withdrawal for gannets and for sea ducks. They both seem to avoid these places, and others are attracted to them as perches, gulls and cormorants, and then they get whacked. So there is a significant problem with birds that is under talked about.
And I'd say there's no free lunch with energy. You know, no matter how you draw your energy, there's going to be some cost involved. I'm just saying that right now, I think that there's an opportunity to create a trade-off that favors removal of dams because of the abundant energy to come. Yes.
I know that you said that there's not a lot of good information about this, but I wonder if you have a rough estimate between these like underutilized small dams and the relic like ghost dams.
So I'm not understanding the question.
Like between the dams that are just kind of underutilized, maybe making a little bit of electricity, and then the dams that are just left over from, you know, which are like your own ponds, backyards, or all this, whatever. Do you know how many, like the percentage would you use?
Oh, well, there's 2,603 hydro dams in the country, so divide that, you know, by 50 states. There's not a huge number, although there can be in some locations, like I said, the Northeast in particular. Maine has a lot of little dams that were converted to hydro. The dams were built originally to hold back water to allow flooding of timber back downstream, because there was a lot of timber harvesting going on. And then after that, the harvesting was over, that phase of life is over, they were retrofitted for hydropower. So Maine is a funny case where you have these giant dams on these big rivers with a lot of hydropower and a lot of these little tiny ones. And every state is different about that, but I'm not sure I'm zeroing in on your question. Okay, yes.
So I've seen these little I've on Cape Cod. There are lots of, as you said, lots of herring ponds and stuff. And I was a couple of years ago, I guess probably during COVID, I was watching one of them, and the fish just never they pooled down below the steps. You know, that it was like a culvert under a road that ended up in a very small little lagoon. But the fish never got over the top, and finally some kids came along with nets and lifted them into the pond.
It's called the herring heave.
So, yeah, so at first I thought that was bad, but now I realize that we should be doing that. But the real question is, how much water I think maybe it was a dry winter or something, and so there was very little water coming down over the tops of the bladder so that the fish didn't really have a cushion of water to get up over the step. So what kind of, you have an idea of whether?
I think they're waiting for heavy rain. You know,
No, they wait.
it's a different system if they get an inch of rain. So they're just staging there, patiently waiting. And I think normally in the course of the spring, that happens, but fish ladders, their workings are between a science and an art.
Yeah.
And I've seen some that were horribly built. I've been involved with a building of a dam in Connecticut on the Naugatuck River, where they put, oh, by the way, this is an egregious situation. It's 1 megawatt of power. And it's taken years now to probably have this thing taken out. 1 megawatt gives you 3 toasters and two microwaves. That's about it. It's crazy to give up a river to that. And the other thing about this river is that there were 8 dams in a row above it that were either bypassed or removed. And the fish can't get past the first dam because it has a ladder that starts way downstream from the dam itself, and then has 100 steps to get up over this not so high dam. So it was, the state of Connecticut estimates that this river could support 20,000 in shad and 30,000 river herring. The totality of those fish over the last decade is about 10. Another utter failure. So I think it's a matter of staging. You know, these small systems are not amenable to everything that the fishery want to do under all conditions. You may have to have more water in the system. I was in Cape Cod once. I remember seeing alewives swimming past the dam, head of the dam, over and over and over again in the pond, but they couldn't get over it because there was no flow. So they were just patiently waiting, hoping that, you know, predatory fish and birds didn't get them before they jumped over and escaped. And the return trips for many of these dams, you know, the thing about these big dams, the hydro dams and the shad is that provisions for the adults to get back down again are very poor. So you may have situations where the fish spawn once, are trapped, die, and you forego second and third spawnings when the fish are bigger, have more eggs. And there's no hope of recovering a population like that.
So I guess we have a little update here for people on the Stony Brook Mill Pond and a paper on machine learning approaches. So if people are interested. Machine learning approaches to identify barriers in stream networks. So
Yeah, there's some very sophisticated analysis going on these days. I'm not able to speak to that, except that I know that there are.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting work going on. What's the point here about?
oh yeah, so that there's some calls for a nature like
Ownership.
fish litter and exactly what you said, that the ownership.
I don't
is
know the
good.
politics of this or
Yeah,
anything, but I just know that I would not put up a traditional dam again. Why would you?
right.
You have all these enlightened scientists around here who should know better than to allow that to happen.
Yeah.
One of the things you did mention, that is not a physical barrier presented by dams. But it is a barrier to basically migratory fish in many cases, which is thermal pollution from the dams. You could tomorrow invent a fish passage with 100% efficiency, place it on many of these small dams, particularly here on Long Island. And yet you would find that basically the river habitat has been still altered to the point where it's uninhabitable by native species simply because of these small ponds, basically these small impoundments acting as thermal collectors that are basically heating the water to the point where they're no longer supporting native species, but are supporting, in many cases, invasive species. And I think it's an important point.
Yeah, I think that there's latitude in the timing of these runs, so that if you have early springs, you'll get these fish coming in earlier. There's flexibility, so they can adjust to that to some degree. But I remember, I'm old enough to remember when there was concern about power plants in the Hudson River. The first concern was the thermal, not the other effects I'll talk about in a moment. There were images of these big plumes going across the river, and people thought they would block migrations. They really didn't. The problem was that sucking all that water into the bowels of the plant, the larvae would get cooked. That's called entrainment, and then the larger fish would get stuck against the screens. That was called impingement, and that was the big factor. I think overall thermal discharges have not been a major factor in the history of these fish.
Maybe for these anadromous fish, but what I'm talking about is, I mean, I've got data from temperature loggers on streams here on Long Island that show, water flowing into the head of the impoundment, water flowing out of the impoundment, being heated by, 10 degrees or more, to the point where it's changing the nature of the system from a cold water ecosystem to a warm water ecosystem. And has effect not just on the migratory fish, but on the entire
Yeah.
ecosystem.
It's not a whole lot you can do about that.
Remove the dam.
My feeling is that these dams along the South Shore are too beloved to go. I don't think you're gonna win that. I think we just build a fish ladder and call it a day. There may be exceptions, I'm not sure, but overall, good luck with that. Yeah,
On a larger scale, I don't think that people are keeping track of climate change and successively greater thermal effects upstream on larger systems, like the Susquehanna, for example. And I think on that scale, that might be a major issue, that is increasing thermal stress as you go upstream. And I mean, there's a lot of data on estuaries changing and rivers changing as a whole, but I don't know if there's any subdivision that's been done, people looking, and that might be a major factor.
I don't know. That's a good point.
There are a lot of.
One factor that plays into that, I think, is a snow melt has become much scarcer than it used to be. And that's icy water pouring into a system at its head.
That also exacerbates the.
Yeah.
This.
I mean, this year maybe we'll have some good snow melt, but overall, it's not been what it used to be.
So everybody, I just want to remind everybody that, and you were gonna just say pizza and I'm gonna say pizza. But also, we're gonna try to set up a table. If you want to talk more about this, you get around and have a little conversation after pizza, maybe 20-30 minutes after we have our first slice, okay? So let's thank John Waldman.
Thank you.